Hello, Michelle and Richard. I am very moved and actually really looking forward to this conversation. And I'd love you to introduce yourselves, to tell our listeners kind of briefly the kind of broader aspects of yourselves, of who you are and where you're from.
So thank you for having us on. We're Michelle and Richard. We have been married for a decade, and we had two children, Elodie, who's 9 now, and Rudy, who we're here to talk about. I suppose we're here to talk about us all, but Rudy was diagnosed with a brain tumour when he was 5, and he died when he was 6. We live in London until the point at which Rudy was ill. I think we both had quite an easy time of it. We didn't really have experience of real grief or death or anything like that. So we've definitely been on a journey in the past year.
Yeah, you really have. And Richard, how are you going to introduce yourself?
I would say that, we live a very normal London life, I guess. We both work full time. We always consider ourselves to be very lucky in terms of life and what that's held for us. As Michelle said, we've never really had to sort of deal with anything before. Elodie's got 4 well grandparents. We all live sort of pretty close by. We're a close-knit family. My brother lives about a mile away in one direction. Michelle's sister lives a couple of miles away in the other direction. All the grandparents are within about 5 or 6 miles. It's always been a great thing.
You live in a village. I mean, you know, everyone talks about that we need a village for a family, and you actually have that lived experience of your parents, grandparents to your kids and siblings who are all kind of very close by.
Yeah, we have. Michelle's got a brother who lives in New York with his family, but everybody else is very close. We live in a lovely part of London where we know all our neighbours and everybody gets on very well. We've lived in this house since before we got married, so we know everyone well, and that also has been a great source of help and comfort for us over the past year. So Rudy died almost exactly a year ago. It'll be a year on Friday.
Oh,
So
gosh.
this is a very poignant time of the year for us.
And those sort of big milestone days are really important. And also, it's kind of every day.
Yes.
There's something, but should we talk about the anniversary a bit later down the track? My question always is, what is the greatest challenge you have faced? And obviously, it's with Rudy. Do you want to say how you kind of tell his story of his illness?
Yeah. So Rudy had really been in perfect health all his life, hit all his kind of developmental milestones, was an amazing, vibrant child. And actually, that's the hardest thing now. When I think of him and when I look at a photo of him, he was just so alive and so vibrant, full of life, really happy. I remember when he was a baby, I used to look after him and take him to play groups and things like that. And I used to think, I can't wait to take him to birthday parties because he's going to be the child dancing and having the most fun. And that's exactly who he was. He enjoyed everything. And
so heartbreaking.
Yeah. And literally one Wednesday, he'd had a bit of a cold the week before. He went to school though on this Wednesday, and he came home and he had a bit of a headache, and Richard was home too. And we gave him Calpol, and we thought that maybe his sinuses were playing up or something like that because he'd been swimming, and we thought after his cold it could be something related to that. But we had a little chat with each other and we said, neither of our kids have ever had a headache before. It's a bit weird. But within 10 minutes of the Calpol, he was fine. And then he had a really nice evening. I've got photos of him and Elodie. They had a bath together that night. And she was combing his hair. She gave him like a Mohican in the bathtub. A happy evening. And he woke up the next morning and was happy again. Breakfast was his favourite meal of the day. He had porridge. And then he had a croissant. He always had like 2 breakfasts. And Richard took him to school and he skipped into school.
I remember I remember so clearly that day he was in year 1 at his school and there was a gate. And once I got to year 1, you were supposed to leave them at the gate and give them confidence to go in. And I remember he ran in and he used to play this sort of game where he would pretend not to say goodbye. And he sort of ran halfway in and then he turned round and he just gave me this sort of big smile and wave. And I that is an image that I think will live with me for the rest of my life. And then he just ran in, and everything was normal until Michelle got a phone call.
So I'd forgotten he was ill, and I was in work that morning, and I saw on my phone I had a missed call from my mum, and that's what made me remember that Rudy had had a headache the previous evening, because she would have been calling to ask how he was. And I had a meeting. The minute I came out of a meeting, my phone rang, and it was Rudy's class teacher, and he just said, Rudy has a headache in school. And he was fairly calm, and I said, oh, do you think I should come and get him? And he said yes.
And we'd already said, hadn't we, Michelle? We'd said that if it happened again, you were going to take him, to A&E or doctor or something.
Yeah, but I thought that he could be. It was a warm day in March, and I thought maybe he was dehydrated or something like that. So I remember stopping off on the way to school, and I bought him a big bottle of water and some popcorn, because I thought I'm going to take him to A&E, and he'll need something to eat and drink. And
also headaches. Children get headaches all the time. Although there was a mini alert in you, it's very ordinary to have a headache for a child.
Well, that's exactly right. And actually, when we looked back with hindsight, we kind of realised that a couple of weeks before he was in a football lesson, and he asked to stop. He was feeling tired, or he always used to wake up early, Rudy, and he'd started sleeping in past 7, and we thought he was just growing. Or he jumped off a sofa and he said his neck was hurting, and we just thought he was hypermobile. We thought, well, he's getting, but it was all moderate sort of.
Nothing that you would have thought, hey, there's something up here. It was all little things that could be completely answered
innocuous
by everything, anything else.
So I got to his school, and they said he's fallen asleep, and I picked him up, and he was very deeply asleep, and I carried him to the Royal Free, which was kind of like maybe a 4 or 5 minute walk, and it felt like I was kind of watching myself in a nightmare, because he wasn't waking up when I was carrying him, and he was very floppy, and I got to A&E, and there was no receptionist there at that particular moment. And then she came, and it was one of those situations where her computer wouldn't turn on. And I didn't know what to do, because I didn't want to be rude to the receptionist. But equally, I was kind of starting to panic. Yeah. And I just said to her, I think my child is floppy. I think he might be unconscious. And she said to me, okay, to be on the safe side, I'll go and get a nurse now. And within seconds, he was in the resuscitation room. There were like 10 doctors around him. They first wanted to rule out a brain infection or some other kind of infection, or I remember them checking his glucose and for diabetes. And we have a friend whose son has diabetes, and I was thinking, please let it not be diabetes. And then they scanned him, and Richard came from work, and Richard was there, and they came and they said, we think he has a tumor.
They said to me that they were like, it was a bleed on the brain, which is what had caused the headache. And they said they weren't sure where it was coming from. It could be from some, I don't remember what the other thing was they said, but then they said to me, or it could be from a tumor. And I said to them, well, when you say it could be from a tumor, and she said, we can see a tumor. And I just remember collapsing, like literally falling down at that.
Like you'd been stabbed.
Yeah.
Or shot. Your life changed in that moment. As you described at the beginning, you'd had a kind of very fortunate life. Everyone has ups and downs, but you'd had a kind of happy, good life, no big tragedy. But at that moment, your life completely turned from one of kind of trust and all predictability to one where you're sort of total devastation.
Exactly. And they were amazing in the hospital, I have to say. And A&E, they put him in a general anaesthetic, and they ventilated him, which stabilised him. Whatever was happening with the bleed on his brain became stable. And they blue lighted him to Great Ormond Street. Richard's brother has a shop really near Great Ormond Street Hospital, and he went there without us asking him, and he just went and he waited, and he met Rudy with the ambulance, so Rudy wasn't alone.
So grateful for those acts of kindness.
Yes.
And then we arrived. Michelle's sister came to pick us up from the hospital and drove us to Great Ormond Street. And I remember going in, and there was a doctor in scrubs, and he said, can I help? And we're like, our son's just come in. And he said, I know exactly who your son is. And he turned out to be the consultant that operated on Rudy.
Yes, and I remember he had a name badge and it said paediatric oncology. And I remember reading his name badge and he knew who Rudy was. And obviously it started to make you think of cancer.
Yeah. It feels like there's two things happening at the same time, like the surreal kind of shock of like being thrown into this terrifying world. And yet within that terrifying world, there was kindness and kind of connection from the doctors at the Royal Free, the paediatrician, the oncologist at Great Ormond Street, and your family that sort of are the small points that keep you upright when you literally are keeling over.
Completely. We had a GP who was like a friend because he'd seen us since the kids were babies, and he was a lovely man. And I texted him to tell him what was happening, and he replied and he said, "Tell Rudy to be awesome," which was a really nice thing to say. And I said it to Rudy, and it made Rudy smile. He could kind of hear us, and Rudy was awesome, but the people around us were awesome too. Our family, the things that we saw and experienced in the hospital, all the staff, the parents of other sick children, we were met with a lot of awesome people all around us.
And as you're talking now, Richard, looking at your face, it looks like you both feel it and it feels surreal. It feels like you're in a kind of liminal place as you're going back to March that year.
Yeah, it's very surreal still to think about all of that. And in many ways, I find that whole period probably much harder than when Rudy actually died, because we can come on and talk about it. We had a sort of strangely nice sort of 4 months once he got out of hospital, and it was a very peaceful end. And it was obviously nobody wants to ever be in this sort of situation, but if we could have chosen a way for it to be, it was exactly that. But that whole 24, 48 hours and then the sort of week afterwards is hugely painful and hugely upsetting.
I'm curious about somehow his actual dying is in some way, I mean, obviously it has an enormous intensity of its own, but there's something about that week that you find particularly painful.
Well, it was the only time that Rudy was in hospital. So he had 2 operations. He had an immediate operation to relieve the pressure in his brain. And then the next day, I think it was the next day, he had an operation to remove as much of the tumor as they could. And then we got the diagnosis and the prognosis about a week later. And we were called into a room. We actually didn't know it was coming. Nobody had told us when we were going to be told, but we were called into a room a bit unexpectedly, sort of early afternoon. There were various people in there, but the meeting was led by one of the oncologists, and we were told that it was a very bad diagnosis. I remember the doctor saying, she said, "I'm afraid it's not good news. It's not good news at all," which was crushing.
And the kindest way of saying it, but still crushing.
Yeah, she said that I don't remember the exact figure, but it was something like there was a 5% chance that he'd live for 2 years, and more if he followed up with the treatment plan that they were suggesting, that he would hopefully have a reasonable quality of life for 6 months. And we sat there.
Devastating diagnosis.
Absolutely. And we sat there, and between the wails and the "I can't believe it" and "how has this happened to us" and all that sort of thing, there was just something that was in my mind going, what we're being offered doesn't feel quite right for a child. So what they were proposing was 6 weeks of radiotherapy daily But because of his age, he would probably have had to have a general anaesthetic every day.
Oh gosh.
And Rudy really hated being in hospital. He hated, that period. He'd been in intensive care and then he'd been moved up to a sort of high dependency ward. But in both the high dependency ward and intensive care, every 15 minutes he was having his vitals taken, and he was getting increasingly
Prodded and
agitated.
pushed and woken.
Exactly. And he was really, really upset, to the point where some of the nurses were sort of having some sympathy with him and just sort of saying, oh, well, we won't do it this time. We'll wait, let him sleep, and so on. And we just sat there and thought, how I sat there and thought, how can I put him through more? So they'd said that this would go on for a sort of 6-week period, and he would go in the morning down to UCH. And, fortunately, we're only probably about 20-25 minutes in a car from there. And he might be able to go to school in the afternoon or something like that. And then he'd, have a reasonable quality of life. And I couldn't quite believe that I was asking the question, but something in me made me. And I just said, and what happens if we don't do that? And I remember, Michelle, you said, I'm so glad you've asked that question.
Yeah, because I was sitting thinking, this doesn't make sense. We're going to really scare him. We're not going to save his life. We're going to harm him, and he'll still die. And I was thinking, this is really awful that we're going to have to do this. But I don't think I would have had it in my brain to be able to kind of work out or say, do we have to go down this route? Because it was very much presented as, this is what you'll be doing. And we're not really used to challenging what we hear in a hospital.
And the challenge you made, which is such an important one, is the quality of life versus the quantity of life.
Yes.
And the kind of calculation, as I understand it, for you was putting him through 6 weeks of radiotherapy where he'd have to be anaesthetized every day and go to school in the afternoon. How much more time will that give him? It's not going to save his life.
So the answer was about 6 weeks. So it was 6 weeks of radiotherapy.
So robbing him of a decent 6 weeks.
Yeah, for about another 6 weeks on top. And they said to us, well, we don't really know because, if I tell you that I remember somebody saying in that room, well, how is he? And somebody said, well, put it like this, he's sitting in his bed playing chess at the moment. And, this is sort of 48 hours after having brain surgery. And they said, well, we've got no experience of a child who's done so well after an operation and had a good operation. I think the surgeon felt he'd done, a really amazing job. And, certainly that seemed to be borne out by what happened afterwards. But they said, we would think you'd be looking at sort of 3-4 months, something like that. We then spoke to another radiologist a couple of days later, and I think she said low months, high weeks, or something like that was the way she described it. And I remember that setting me off, that finding that just that high weeks really sort of distressing language.
Overwhelming. Yeah.
But very quickly in my head, I'm sitting there totting it up and thinking, well, hang on a minute, something's not quite right here. And then we didn't obviously say, well, what we're going to do, though I think I did say something along the lines of, well, I'm certainly not minded to put him through that. And I think when we talked about it, what we said was, well, if this was me, if it were me that were ill, I think I'd probably put myself through quite a lot so that my children could spend more time with me. But when it's the other way around and you're having to sort of take those decisions for a 5-year-old, he's not old enough, not old enough to make those decisions himself. And I was saying, well, what are we? Who's benefiting from this? Because it's not him. He's not going to benefit from getting another few weeks with us. The only people that are going to get something out of that is us. And that just felt a little bit wrong. And so we went away and we cried lots.
Yeah, we agonized, and we spoke to other people. We spoke to a really kind of a range of other people, and one of them was somebody who had also lost a son, but who was a medic. And he said to us, well, you'll bring Rudy home from hospital and you'll speak to Rudy and you'll see did he enjoy hospital? What did he think of hospital? And you'll make your decision. which was really good advice,
Right,
and it was the right thing to say because Rudy hated hospital.
So on the day when we were hoping that he'd be able to leave, so it was the day after we were given the diagnosis, he was increasingly annoyed that he was there. And I think the day before I'd taken him out in a wheelchair around the ward, I'd finally got him out of bed, and he was really worried about leaving bed. And he was so happy to be in that wheelchair, I remember. And I wheeled him around for 2 hours maybe, and he was just so happy. And
that sense of freedom again.
yeah, and he was that child. He always wanted to be, he was always out running around and wanting to do stuff. He was never the kid that sort of sat at home and so on. And he said to me, "What do I have to do to get out of here?" And I said,
Oh,
"Well, the
wow.
doctors want to see that you can walk to the end of the ward because they need to see that you're going to be okay when you go home." And he basically refused to get out of bed for a week, and he just went, "Fine," and he jumped out of bed and literally ran down the corridor. And he came back and he said, "Can we go now?" And that's
Very authoritative.
what I remember. And so that's what we did. We literally picked up our stuff and we went. And we got given a wheelchair, which, to be honest, we rarely used. We used it once or twice, but he was always well. And we jumped in a cab and we came home. And
Michelle, I can see you looking tearful. What's coming up for you?
Well, I'm always tearful, but I'm thinking about Rudy and how vibrant and alive he was in that moment to jump out of bed and run to
so
run
kind
through
of
the
punchy.
corridor.
So like, don't mess with me.
Yeah, and he's still. I think other people might hear the story and think, the child, he had a terminal brain tumor. He was in hospital for a week. He had 2 brain surgeries, and he was 5. But actually, he was his own person, and he was
such a character.
Yeah,
such a character.
Yeah.
He sounds so himself. Like, don't mess with me. I'm just being me. And me's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Also, it's hard for a child to be in hospital. He was in a neuro ward in a children's hospital, and with babies,
sick children,
sick children, and some parents who had been living in the hospital. There was a dad next to us, and this was March, and he'd been there since January, just looking after his baby on his own. And there's a lot of distress around, and that affected him too.
It's very contagious, that distress, and also seeing 6 kids, even if they're not making suffering noises, you can feel the suffering.
Yes.
So it sounds like in some ways, as in an impossible decision as it was a natural decision not to give him treatment. Like, you didn't talk to people and you cried together and talked together, but in some ways it was almost a decision that made itself.
I remember we had another meeting on the Friday, so we got home on the Thursday, and we had another meeting on the Friday with a radiologist from the team that would have given him the treatment at UCH. It was a conference call, and we basically had to make up our mind. They would have started on the Monday, and so time was very short in terms of making decisions. But I do remember when we agonized over it, I remember Michelle saying, "I think we'll probably look back on this and it will just be a blip, and it will be a natural decision. It won't be something that we'll think on."
Agonize,
yeah. And although it was agonizing at the time, and it really was, because you sit there thinking, well, what if I'm doing the wrong thing? What if, something horrible goes wrong or so on? For him, it didn't feel like the right thing. And what it meant was that we could then spend that next period doing everything for him. And we were very lucky. We both fortunately worked for employers who were amazing and who basically said, "We'll see you when we see you, and don't worry about a thing."
So you both stopped work.
Yeah, and you can't underestimate that. I did a little bit here and there in the background, more just to sort of keep my brain occupied with something other than
to distract you.
This, but not in any meaningful way. And Michelle, you completely stopped, didn't you?
I completely stopped from the moment I left work to go and see Rudy in hospital. And obviously I contacted work and I told them what was happening. I don't know what they did, but I didn't get a single email until after I came back to work, well after Rudy had died. So they Richard works
They
for a
protected
big
you.
organisation. I work for a tiny team, but both of them protected us. Yeah.
And were amazing.
That's
And
very unusual.
gave us really like the gift of spending time with our son.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, was really amazing.
And I mean, it makes me cry thinking about it. That gift of those 3 or 4 months was the time that you will look back on your entire life as the most precious time of your
It really
life.
was. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but it was a happy time, first of all, and it was precious. We both work full time. When Rudy was a year old, I went back to work, and of course, I missed spending more time with him. And it was a gift to suddenly have 3 months of Rudy.
Do you want to bring in Elodie at this point?
Elodie was
she's his big sister.
She's the doting big sister. She's as vibrant and great as he was. She really, really loved him and cared for him. And for her, it was obviously a huge shock because, like him, she had no experience of hospital or what that meant. And I remember when we had to explain to her that he was in hospital, and she was like, "Oh, well, he'll be out tomorrow, won't he?" And better, sort of thing, because that's just what happens if you go to hospital. I think her only experience was
they fix you and then you come home.
Yeah, when she was 2, she dislocated her elbow, and she went to hospital, and they put it back together again, and that was it. And that's pretty much the only time. So for her, it was that.
When Rudy was at the point of being transferred from A&E to Great Ormond Street, we agreed that we would tag team, and that one of us would always be there for Elodie and one of us would always be there for Rudy. So even while Rudy was in hospital, one of us would spend the night with Rudy, one of us would be at home with a grandparent or an auntie or someone, so that Elodie would wake up and see a parent. So she was absolutely with Rudy at the forefront of how we were thinking, and we wanted to prioritise her as well.
And I remember saying once we were home and we'd go on long walks together and talk about things and what might happen in the future and so on. I remember.
So you told her the truth straight away. What did you say?
No. We didn't want to tell Rudy that he was going to die because we didn't want him to be frightened while he was still well. And we equally didn't want to have secrets within the family and give Elodie, who was 8, this huge piece of information.
Yeah.
But we didn't think she could possibly be expected to hold. It wouldn't be fair on any 8-year-old.
No, and she was too young to understand it. Actually, all our nieces and nephews who are older were all told everything, and none of them understood it, and they were teenagers, some of them. But we equally weren't going to lie to them. And so they both knew that Rudy had a tumour and that the doctors couldn't take out his whole tumour, and that his headache that he'd had might come back, and that he was very sick. And we hoped that by giving them those truthful facts, that if Rudy's headache did come back, or when his headache came back, we would keep their trust.
And did he ever ask you if he was going to die?
Yes, he didn't ask if he was going to die, but one night, very soon after we came home from hospital, he was still on steroids and he couldn't sleep, and he was feeling really poorly at that point. He got much better really quickly once he was off the steroids, but they did affect him. And he was lying in bed and he said to me, he called it a cold, which reflects how well he'd been before, because that was just his thing of when you were ill, you had a cold. And he said, "Mummy, I think this cold is going to kill me."
Gosh.
And I don't know what I said to him, but I didn't say to him, "No, it won't." I think I probably said to him, "You have a tumour and there's still some of it there. It couldn't all be taken out."
So at some level he sort of knew, and also
yes, I think he knew he was very sick.
Knew together.
Yeah.
But it was too much reality to name it specifically, because that was too crushing in a way.
Well, we didn't know what was going to happen. We thought that from our conversations with doctors, we had thought that Rudy would decline in health and have like maybe quite a long period where he was really, really sick. And that would be a time in which we could talk to Elodie and talk to Rudy in whichever way was best for Rudy.
I remember us saying, we know he's going to die. And so during this period, the most important person is Rudy. And the second most important person is Elodie. And then he's going to die. and then the most important person is going to be Elodie. And so everything that we did, we tried to frame around that.
From that perspective. Yeah.
What are we doing, here? Is this the best thing for Rudy? And it's like, you can't explain to a 5-year-old, as he was then, that he's going to die. He doesn't even understand what that means. So you carry on and you talk about that. And if you can't explain to a 5-year-old, you can't tell an 8-year-old, because the 8-year-old won't be able to keep it from the 5-year-old as to what's happened or what's going to happen. And that obviously then meant that we couldn't really tell anybody what was going to happen. So we had lots of well-wishers, obviously, and some people even went as far as to say, well, what's the prognosis? And, we just had a line along the lines of, it's very serious, or something like that, because we didn't want something to get out and somebody say to one of them something
At
that...
school
exactly.
friend of Elodie's or something.
Exactly. So that was the compromise, I guess, in terms of, to protect them, we had to do whatever we had to do.
So you had these 3 months where he was actually surprisingly extremely well until 2 days before he died.
That's right. So his school said to us, we'll do whatever Rudy needs. So we dipped in and out of school. We'd maybe go to school for a couple of hours a day, where his teacher described the rock star's welcome he got every time he went in. And he really did. The other children, I think the other children knew he was ill. Like inside them, they could sense it. And they looked after him so well. Yeah. I remember taking him to a birthday party at Soft Play, and it was a 6th birthday. And really exciting for the children to be in a huge Soft Play. And 2 of the children, who he wasn't even particularly friendly with, but a boy and a girl, stayed by his side within the Soft Play for the full hour. They didn't not once run ahead or try and have their own fun.
Him.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And he looked well. I mean, it's not like he looked sick, but they knew he was sick. And so he'd go and have fun, and the teacher would really spoil him, and he had a nice time. And we'd go for lunch and come home and rest. And he loved maths, and we used to say to him, rate, if he was in pain, we'd say out of 10, how bad is it? And the most it was kind of like a 2. And
Gosh.
then in the days before he died, it was suddenly a 4.
And then he needed medication.
Yeah. And actually, I do want to say we had the palliative care team with us throughout this whole period. And at the beginning, when we were told you're left with palliative care, we were kind of horrified. And I remember before the consultant
death,
and
palliative,
nurses,
doesn't it? Yeah,
exactly. The consultant and the nurses were going to come to our house to plan, and I remember dreading the meeting. I mean, I don't think I slept, nor Richard, the night before. And they came, and they were phenomenal. They just were incredible, both to Rudy. They got to know him. They sat and played chess with him. They gave him bits of medical equipment. They had fun with him. And with us, they just gave us their time and their knowledge. And they were always at the end of a phone. At the time, there were doctor strikes and things like that. But no matter what was going on, if we needed to speak to someone, you just rang a number and they were there.
That takes a lot of the fear out for you. I mean, there was obviously great fear all the time, but having a kind of reliable team that you can call on is
absolutely
a big protector.
And we had all the medication in our house. Thankfully, he really never used it, but we had like a massive kind of bag full of everything that he might have needed at home.
During that period, what did we do? We did loads of fun stuff. But we had charities would call up and say, oh, we can arrange a once in a lifetime trip to wherever, and we just said, no, that's not, it's really, really kind, but it's not really what we want to do, because what he wanted, what he liked doing the most, was just having a nice time with his family, with his friends at home. That's where he felt most comfortable. It didn't feel right to sort of say, right, let's all go abroad and so on, because if he had felt unwell, we didn't want to do that. And I remember there was, over half term in May, we took them to Primrose Hill, and the 2 kids ran up Primrose Hill, and he ran it literally at full speed from the very bottom, and you never would have known there was anything wrong with him at all. We took him to the Lido, and outdoor swimming in ice cold water, and he loved that. And then just more generally, he loved chess. Yeah, he loved chess, and he just played chess constantly, hours a day. He used to play, his cousin in New York, he used to sit and play on the computer with. He'd play with anyone that was
Such
willing to, at home as well. I absolutely hated chess, but I learned to love it to spend time playing with him. Connect Four was his other thing, and he would challenge anybody that was willing.
He was a numbers boy, wasn't he? He loved strategy and numbers.
He was, but we just did all that stuff, and it was, yeah, as Michelle said, it was actually a really nice period of time with the four of us. Elodie would come home from school, and we.
It's such a paradox, that, isn't it? While the worst thing in the world that could ever be happening, while your son was, the tumor, I imagine, was growing and he was dying, he was actually well and alive, and so you have these embodied deep memories in you that you mine all the time. I can see in your eyes as you go back and remember the Lido or the chess or the Connect Four or playing with him, seeing him running up Primrose Hill. The love for him stays alive in those memories that you can call on.
And we're well aware that not everybody else has that luck. We've met other families who've been in a similar situation since then, and everybody's got a different story. But we're well aware that we had a good time during that period.
On his last well day, he woke up, whereas before, that the pain had been a 2, it kind of had got up to a 4, and so we switched his medication. We still thought he seemed quite well. We thought we would go to Devon or Cornwall for a few days. We were planning that and the week ahead. But he went to school. School were doing an art exhibition for the kids, and they'd all done self-portraits, and the art teacher really wanted Rudy to finish his portrait. So he went in for a little bit to do that, and he came home, and family came over to see him. His cousin, luckily from New York, was in London, and another cousin was with him, and grandparents. And a friend called and said that she couldn't pick her kids up from school. Both her daughters were good friends with both of our children, and they came round and they had a lovely play date. And the girls started to watch Matilda, and Rudy decided he was feeling tired, but he said to me, it's a girly movie, I'm going to go to bed. And he looked at his friend who was there, the younger sister who he adored, and he said to her, just remember, I'll always love you.
Oh my goodness.
Because we'd been saying things like that to him, because we were kind of anticipating that he might be sick and not able to understand what was going on, and we wanted him to have the sound of us in his head saying, we love you.
Yeah.
And he said, remember, I'll always love you. And he went upstairs, and I thought, he's too tired to have a bath before bed. So we sent him straight to bed. And an hour later, we heard him screaming.
And it was exactly the same as what had happened 4 months earlier. So essentially the bleed, whether it was a bleed or whether it was the tumor had grown over the part that had caused it, whatever, it was exactly the same thing. So he had a number of seizures. We came down to his bedroom. I think I popped upstairs to do a small amount of work for 10 minutes or something. And I remember, Michelle, you shouted up and you were like, he's screaming. And we went down to his room. I was on the top floor. You were downstairs in the kitchen, and his bedroom was in the middle. And we came in, and he was having a seizure. And so we had the seizure medication, and we just gave it to him straight away. And he had a number of seizures, one after the other. And I basically sat with him on the floor, and I just held him. And Elodie was there, and she saw everything. And she understood at that point that he was seriously unwell again. And as I think we'd said, our plan was that there would be a longer period where we'd be able to explain that to her. But she stayed up. My brother and his wife came round that night, and they looked after Elodie. And then it got a bit later on. It was about 10 o'clock, and he'd sort of come down here. I think he'd been sick, and he was essentially, by that point, calm in bed, sleeping, sound.
Awake. Oh, sleeping.
No, he was sleeping. That's what it was. He was not awake and weak.
He couldn't be woken, but
And we called family, and we said, we don't know, but you might want to come tonight just in case. And so all the family came at about 10, 11, something like that. I don't really remember. And then we had paramedics came, but they didn't at that point think it was going to be fatal. And I remember one of them saying, he'll probably just wake up in the morning and be quite groggy. And
this was someone from the children's hospice. They were used to they knew what they were saying,
Patterns.
but it wasn't a foregone conclusion that he was going to die the next day.
But there was something in me that made me think, no, I really think this is it.
And in you, Michelle, did you think the same?
I remember hoping that he wouldn't have a prolonged period of suffering, that actually, it sounds awful when we describe he was having seizures and stuff, but it was all quick and he was comfortable and he was at home and he was with all of us. And I just remember thinking, I hope this is just the end.
Yeah, because your love of him is so great. The priority is that he doesn't suffer.
Exactly. And Richard and I stayed in his room. We'd moved his bed while he was still quite well, because we thought if he is going to have a period of sickness at home, we're going to want to be on either side of him. So we'd kind of swapped around his room and we'd bought a Z bed. And I remember we both kind of slept next to him in the Z bed that night. I can't really say we slept, but we were next to him and we were listening to his breathing. And suddenly I'd said to the nurses we were on the phone to, like, throughout the evening, should I go and wake up Elodie? And they said, no, let her sleep. And the sound of his breathing suddenly changed.
And that was about 5 a.m., wasn't it? I remember.
Yeah.
And
I phoned and I said, his breathing just sounds different. It was suddenly really loud.
That rasping breathing, yeah.
And they said, go and wake up Elodie.
So we woke her up. It was 10 to 7. She was, my sister-in-law had stayed with her in her room. And we woke her up and we said that he was very unwell. And she said, is he going to die? And we said, yes. And we came and there was lots of crying.
Yeah.
And we had to go and say our goodbyes.
So we all poured into his
painful.
room. She was very frightened and she just said, I want to go to school. And she remembers me saying this to her. I said, you won't thank me for sending you into school today. I can't send you into school. But I messaged a head teacher, a deputy head teacher in her school. And I said, and they knew what was going on and they'd been really supportive all throughout. And I said, would you come round? I think it would really help if you were here. And she said, I'll be there in half an hour.
Wow.
And so she was in the house along with our good friend, who she's a rabbi. She wasn't our rabbi, but she stepped in to kind of help us and had been helping us throughout the previous few months. And lots of people were in the house. And for Elodie, I think just having this teacher who she really trusted there, along with her cousins, she relaxed and she was able to come into the room and spend the time with Rudy. And we were all there at the point at which he died. The room was full. There were maybe, how many people do you think were in the room, Rich? Like
over
a lot.
A dozen, probably.
Yeah. The nurses had been due to come to our house that day to check him because we were going to go away. I'd booked in a visit because I said, can you just have a look at him before we go? I mean, they would have been there, but they were due to be there that day. And actually, if you look around the room, it was all the people who he really loved.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's such a strange concept, but that is what you wanted, which was a good death. I mean,
yes.
You never want the death, particularly of he was 6 then, wasn't he? Just 6. But I can see your faces that it's deeply painful, and at the same time there's a sense of, is it peace or some kind of sense of in your soul that, given that you couldn't stop him dying, that this was the death that I can't even find the words, but this was the one that was least traumatic for all of you.
If it had to happen, it's how we would have wanted it to happen.
Yes, that's.
And I remember us being very concerned about whether we would be able to have that, or whether we would get, if we needed, as it happened, we didn't really need very much, help from doctors and nurses. Had we been in a position where we would have done, we were quite anxious beforehand about whether we would get that at home. And then the nurse who was, responsible for him made very clear to us one day that it just wouldn't be an issue, and that was a huge relief for us. And yeah.
So I mean, it's coming up to the anniversary, and there's another whole session in the year since him dying, which unfortunately we don't have time for. But I think for everyone listening, as you're coming up to the anniversary on Friday, what is it that you've learned and what's helped you through such a devastating loss?
I think for us, all the way through from the moment Rudy first became ill, to getting the diagnosis, to bringing him home, to him dying, to the period since, we have had to accept a loss of control. We cannot control
Total
events.
loss of control.
Yes. And we haven't fought against that. We haven't tried to.
You've surrendered.
We've surrendered. And I think that's really helped. And actually, in darkest moments of being sad about Rudy, I remind myself, we didn't cause this. No one caused this. It happened. No one could control it. And actually, for us, that is really a comfort.
It comes with grace, doesn't it, surrender, in that you kind of hand it over, in the sense that you're not trying to wrestle something to the ground and fight what you can't fight,
Exactly.
which is a kind of crazy-making torture that brings so much rage and fury, whereas when you can kind of lift your eyes and hand it over, in a sense, whether you have faith or not. I know you're Jewish, but whatever your belief system, there is a grace and a peace that comes with that.
Yes. And instead of railing against what was happening, we have tried to channel our energy into Rudy and into Elodie. And for us,
love.
Yeah.
And I think, as we said at the beginning, we didn't really have any experience of death or grief in any, beyond,
natural ways, as it were, grandparents.
Before this happened. And I think it's very easy to assume that you're going to be in a situation where, 6 months on or a year on or 18 months on, you'll be absolutely fine. And I think what we've gone through in the past year, we would say that we accept the fact that the grief is never going to go.
No.
And that doesn't mean to say that you can't also be happy. Every morning I wake up and within a few minutes I've thought about Rudy. I can't think there's a
and the
single
stab
day
of missing him.
Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that we can't get on and do stuff. And we made a promise to ourselves after the funeral. We said, we're not going to spend the rest of our lives in bed. And I don't think there's a single day where we haven't got up and gone out and done something. Even in the immediate aftermath, we've gone out and we've had a nice time, and we've had Elodie to look after and live for.
Love.
And people say, "Oh, I don't know how you do it," and things like that. And you do because you have to, but you also do because one person had their life ruined, and that doesn't mean to say that 3 more people need to. And so we have gone out and we've challenged ourselves, and we've done fun things. We've gone on holiday. Elodie made us go on 2 kilometers zip wire, which we never would have done before. But we just said we need to do this for her. We need to do fun things, and we've tried to keep those things. We've tried to celebrate his life by making the most of ours, I guess.
I mean, that's such a beautiful way to end, in that the kind of celebration of loving him and keeping him alive is having a lot of life and love in your life. And that there is, of course, alongside that, intense grief. But it isn't the grief that you want to define your life. It's the life and the love, his vitality, which was so powerful. You somehow want to kind of honour that by having it in yourselves. As a whole family system, and I imagine with your siblings and parents and with your neighbours.
Absolutely.
Thank you both so much. And thank you to Rudy for his life and how he lives in you. And I'm so sorry at the devastation of his loss.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Sophie and Emily. So this is our reflections on my conversation with Richard and Michelle, which was very heartbreaking. Tell me your first thoughts, feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a very painful listen, a very emotional listen from my perspective. Sophie and I both have 5-year-olds. And I think my biggest reaction was really not actually any thoughts or words, but it was really very much in my body. Yeah, so I felt as I was listening to them talk through the story in such incredible sort of poignant detail, I felt really frozen. I felt really sick. That sort of dread feeling like this just can't be true. And actually, it was definitely sort of one of those ones. I listened to it in the evening, and then my children were asleep, so I had to go upstairs and, sort of see them.
Yeah.
So it was. I just, it was a very difficult, painful listen, and I felt so grateful to both of them for sharing Rudy with us, because I could also really hear his sparkiness and his aliveness
Yeah.
in their story. But yeah, it was. I definitely cried a lot, and like I said, it was sort of very much a sort of body reaction rather than a words reaction.
Yes, you sort of forewarned me, so
I did.
I went in maybe a bit, not, a little bit prepared, and sat in a cafe and cried when I listened to it. And I listened to it this morning, so I can still feel it. I can still feel it in my body. And I messaged you and said, I want to go to school and see my children now. And so I guess there's definitely that, as Emily said, a kind of a visceral, emotional journeying with their story. And then as I was sort of reflecting a bit afterwards, trying to put into words what the kind of, what the gift is in them offering up a story like this for people's listening.
So personal.
That's so deeply personal, and is that it sort of puts me in touch in that way of wanting to run to school and see my children with those people that I love the most, obviously particularly my children because of the story, but all of you, you guys included. And it has, for that moment, you can't live there, but for that moment it kind of sweeps away the daily noise and worry, and puts you back in touch with the perspective of love and what's most precious. And they were so in touch themselves with what was most precious. The way they spent that 3 or 4 months with Rudy and with Elodie, and how all the people around them supported that to be possible. It just makes something very raw, something very shine out about what matters most. That most of the time, lots of us get lost, lose perspective.
And so
for
just,
that.
yeah. And as you're speaking, kind of two connecting thoughts come to my mind. One of which is, of course, that a child dying tears up the rule book of life. Like, you should never expect a child to die or to bury your own child. And it's, his ordinary symptoms of a headache, we just give Calpol. And so then the devastation of that. But the other side of that, and connects to what you're talking about love and perception, it puts me in touch with awe, the awe, proper awe in my being, of them being able to speak about Rudy and love Rudy in his way, but also the way in those moments it is a mysterious and extraordinary. I'm not taking the pain away from it, but there's something about it that really takes us to the heart of what life is about, which is love.
Yeah, and like the sort of love and grace in the whole family to sort of love him enough to put what he needed first.
Yeah.
In terms of the impossible decision they had to make, and loving him enough to be able to enjoy that chunk of time and see it as a gift.
And the kindness
Really
they were
extraordinary.
surrounded by.
Yes, I was very struck by what feels like the unusualness, but maybe that's underestimating our world, of having such of their ability to hold Rudy and Elodie, obviously being so dependent on everyone being able to hold them the way the doctors and the nursing staff held them, their own family held them, their friends, their neighbours, that kind of none of those people can take away from the devastation or the pain of what is happening, but you can support people to have a different process, so they're not accumulating other pain alongside it, other complications, other suffering,
Yeah, that's a good
which
point.
they have to then deal with, being let down or lack of trust or not having time. You know, people at
Being
work,
upset,
being able to give
yeah.
them the time. You can't take away that pain, but you can support them in pain. And that was very beautiful to hear, really. It was kind of, yeah, there was a beauty in that.
And it made me, you know, it really struck me the number of times they used the word luck in their conversation. And so there's also a piece around a capacity to see the good in the things around you, when it would be really understandable and totally also, you know, it's not a judgment to not feel any luck in a situation like that, and yet they were sort of able to have gratitude
They did have
in
real
amongst this
grace.
pain. Yeah.
You know, from my work at Child Bereavement UK and St Mary's, the difficult dilemma of when to tell Elodie, what to tell Elodie, when to talk to Rudy, what to talk to Rudy about his dying. And then that incredibly kind of poignant thing that he said, Mummy, I think this cold is going to kill me, in that he knew, and that children often do know. And that was so kind of
Yes.
heartbreaking. But also she was able to love him and support him, so he wasn't frightened. And Elodie too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question that comes up a lot with any terminal diagnosis, whether that's out of time or a grandparent, like how much information to give and when to give it. And I think it's really personal, isn't it?
There isn't a right
Of
or
what
wrong.
feels right. There isn't a right or wrong beyond, I think, if at all possible, not actively lying.
Yes.
Because I think that is really tempting, but also can be quite destructive in the longer term. So
Trust.
I mean,
Yeah.
yes, and so I think being honest, but not necessarily giving the whole picture straight away, and drip feeding information as it feels right to give it, or it makes sense to give it. And I imagine it would have been impossible for them to believe right at the beginning when his body seemed
He's so chirpy,
so healthy.
so
Yeah.
alive.
So yes, exactly, Mums. There's not a right or a wrong.
I think it is unhelpful.
personal
If you maintaining trust is essential, and so you can't lie. You can say you don't know yet, or I think there are things that you can say that aren't outright.
Yes, they seemed to find a set of words, didn't they, that allowed them to be honest.
Like he's really unwell.
He's really unwell,
He's really
without
unwell.
without having to slip into a place of having to break trust, which must have required a lot of thought and consideration. I wondered, Mum, whether you had any thoughts for people who might be listening who were not able to reach a place of surrender, or where there have been greater complications on the journey of losing a child, or a child dying. I don't know if you have any words to support them. I'm sort of imagining, if I was listening to this and my journey was more complicated with my child's death or more sudden, I might also feel like, well, what can I do to help myself in this moment, when maybe there were more other difficulties that came in, complications.
So I think often what happens during the process is that it's sometimes unbearable to face it in the eye, as they did, and to want to do everything you can for a cure in the hope that you could, for instance. And that isn't wrong either at all. I think what can happen following the death of a child is that both the parents can get on a kind of Sherlock Holmes examination of every decision they made, and all the what ifs and the rumination and the regrets, and the guilt. And I think what I would encourage people to do is that it's in some ways normal and healthy to go back and examine the decisions that you made, but to do it from a position of, I did the best I can with what I knew at the time and who we all were and the position we were in at the time. And as we say, almost every single conversation we have, with kindness and compassion, not with self-attack. And I think one of the crudest aspects of grief is often the pain that people feel they turn against and punish themselves with. And so be aware of that, trying not to turn against yourself, because really this is a really agonizing process. And like turning on yourself as well is just making pain. There will always be pain, but when you turn on yourself, you turn the pain into suffering, which isn't necessary.
Yeah, I saw on one of the videos you put out, which I thought was really powerful on Instagram, was about this idea of being able to love your child enough that they stay alive. That we have that fantasy that we should be able to love them enough to keep them alive, and that somehow, therefore, when they die, we have failed in some way
to love
them enough. We must have done something wrong along the line for this to be the outcome
that we're being punished for.
Yeah, we must have made a mistake, made a bad call, if we'd only done X differently or Y. And that, I guess, one of the ways that we might think about that would be interesting. What you think is, when something happens that's unbearable, we want some sense of control over it. Like if we could have done something differently, it wouldn't have happened. And it's almost a preoccupation around, I can't let this be true. And if I get into a deep rumination about my own failure and what we could have done differently, there's still some fantasy that there was some control in this experience that would have changed the outcome.
I think it is. I think it connects a lot to what children do, which is if they can't make sense of something, and there is no making sense of a sibling dying or a parent dying when they're still really young, is the way to make sense of it is to have control over it. And I think it's about making sense of what has happened, but I think it's also, at least for children, a way of making sure it doesn't happen again. So if you've had the experience of, okay, one day everything was okay, my family was okay, and then the next day I know my daddy isn't here anymore, then your terror is, okay, well, if that can happen, then that can happen again. And so I think the sort of control of like, well, if I was with daddy, or if I had done this, or if that sort of magical thinking is then also a way of trying to control making sure nothing terrible ever happens again. Like mommy must be in sight of me all the time, because if I can see her, I can make sure she's okay. And if I'm away from her, something bad might happen. So I think it's a way of sort of trying to control the present as well as the loss.
Yes, so I think that's really articulately put. And I think we do as adults. And I think that those strategies, I guess, for survival, for emotional survival in the face of devastation, if you can notice that when you attack yourself in that way, in a way you're trying to survive, but you don't need to think that it's true. It's that little breathing space.
It's a magical thinking.
That this is me trying to survive this pain when I have those attacking thoughts, or when I tell myself I failed my child, or when I tell myself if I'd only done X, it would be like, this is me doing my best to stop this ever happening again, but it's not the same as that story being true, or that I did fail. And if you can bring even that little like breath of self-compassion into it, even if you can't stop the thoughts from coming, it's different to fully identifying with that as actually what happened.
One of the other gifts they gave us in this conversation was in recognizing so powerfully that grief continues, it changes, and they have, built their life. They've built their life around Rudy's death and with Elodie and with each other. But that will be with them and part of them always. And I think that was part of the reason they wanted to do the podcast, because it's like, and I understand that, it's like having on record what they feel in a way that we often don't have an opportunity to do in our life.
And giving us a little bit of Rudy. I mean, that was
so
delightful. Like him just like jumping out of the wheelchair. Like, okay, I want to do this to go home.
And he was playing chess, for God's sake.
I know. Yeah, just like that's. I mean, to me, that was a gift, and just to sort of hear about him. And we didn't hear so much about Elodie. We kind of got a sense of her too. It's such a really wonderful sister.
The sort of rich descriptions, of Rudy, and also then going through the story of what happened. they felt like sort of crystallizations of memory, like they could still see it all in their mind's eye. Both the painful, devastating moments, but also those bright shininess of Rudy in those sort of funny, very himself, delighting moments of how he was. And, even I could feel myself going, ooh, feeling lifted by going back to the
when they
energy.
Talked about him, they shone.
Yeah. And I wonder what made them want to do this podcast 1 year on is still very soon after a child's death. And I had the thought, it must be rather lovely maybe to have this recording for themselves in the future, so that when the little details slip away, they have a recording of what they remembered so well a year in. And I remember a client I had who had a child who died through an accident, so unexpectedly. But the videos and the photos they had of their child all through childhood became like most precious, most sacred moments of reconnecting with their love and with their child. And it's having things like possibly like a recording like this where they get to memorialize him,
connect him. And I think where that takes me is how different as a couple you can grieve. So, they were very clearly very different, although totally aligned. And, so if I have a couple who I'm seeing who one of them can't look at films or videos at all, or photos, and the other one looks at them a lot. And so it's very, I think the one that can't look at them wants them there, obviously, as a kind of total, kind of deep, important memory bank, but it's too much.
It's too painful.
It's too painful.
I think the other thing I really heard from them was the importance of having your voice heard and Rudy's voice through them being heard, and how even though no one was sort of even suggesting as an option not doing treatment, they were able, not easily, completely agonizingly, but they were able to kind of speak for Rudy in thinking, actually, no, is this really the right thing to do? What is it actually going to get us, and what is it going to cost? I think
he hates hospitals.
Right, and the sort of courage that must have taken to be able to ask that question in the face of all these medical providers who sounded like were really supportive and listening, but also it's not what they had said, right? They weren't like, we could do this or could do that. And, I think it sort of spoke to really like the courage of both of them.
My last thought was as a shift away from them and towards us as therapists. Because I was noticing how much it affected my body listening to the story, and Emily, and I was thinking about you, Mum, who've done so much work with families and grief and child loss. And I was thinking about, how to carry these stories, how to care for us while listening to clients. I was particularly thinking of it because, we were all at a trauma conference last week together in Oxford, and Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, talked about how he'd always thought that all his trauma sort of stories that he carried around from the clients he worked with hadn't affected him. And then when he was doing a study on psychedelics and he took some MDMA as part of the study of the research, he got visited by all the traumatic stories he'd heard throughout his life. And it was a very overwhelming experience for him. It just struck me, that thing of how these stories, both for me, felt like they open your heart in a huge way because of the love and the connection to grief being the sort of flip side of love. And also they get into your cells, and there's some care needed, isn't there, for therapists who do this kind of work.
I think we could do a whole pod on what we do and how we hold things. And I think not just therapists, all sorts
but in life,
caregivers in life, and actually in a funny sort of way, therapists, you have some systems that are inbuilt to carry you, right? Like you have a supervisor.
Recognition.
You are sort of trained to know when actually this is too much and I need extra help. And you think of all the sort of professions out there,
lawyers,
lawyers, but also like nurses,
policemen,
all of these professions
Absolutely.
that are experiencing and facing stories and traumas and stresses that don't have these kind of systems in place.
Yeah.
I think it's Yeah, we could do a whole pod just on
Point,
that.
point well made.
Or multiple. I think it would be nice just to sort of bring it back
Yes.
Yeah.
to Rudy in some way, and Michelle and Richard and Elodie, just really to sort of thank them for sharing their experiences in such a sort of raw, powerful, and incredibly moving way.
Absolutely.
You've said it. That I feel exactly that. So grateful to them and
So generous.
and also I feel the joy of Rudy. So thank you very much, Richard and Michelle, and thank you all for listening. And we really appreciate every listen that we have. And as painful as this episode is, if you do think it's helpful for someone, do please share it and help people find us by rating and subscribing to the podcast. Thank you.